The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Presage. Towards evening the heavy sky began to disintegrate, and a short time before sundown a wind from the west carried the clouds away in dense and shambly masses, and the rain with them. Most of the day had been spent in ceremonial observance of multifarious kinds, both in the castle and in the downpour, culminating in the pilgrim-like procession of the 43 gardeners headed by Pentecost to Gormenghast mountain and back, during which time it was their duty to meditate upon the glory of the House of Groan, and especially on the fact that its latest member was 12 months old, a subject, however momentous, they must surely have exhausted after the first mile or so of the soaking and rock-strewn paths that led them over the foothills. Be that as it may, Barquentine, lying exhausted on his dirty mattress at 8 o'clock in the evening, and coughing horribly as his father had done so convincingly before him, was able to look back with sour satisfaction on a day of almost undiluted ritual. It had been an irritating thing that Lord Sebelcrave had been unable to attend the last 3 ceremonies, but there was a tenet in the law which exonerated his absence in the case of dire illness. He sucked his beard, and his withered leg lay quite still. A few feet above his head a spider crawled itself across the ceiling. He disliked it, but it did not anger him. Fuchsia had regained consciousness within a short while, and with Mrs. Slagg had bravely taken her part in the day's observances, carrying her small brother whenever the old nurse grew weary. Prunesqualler, until late in the evening when he left Flay with his lordship, had kept a strict watch upon his patient. An indescribable atmosphere of expectancy filled Gormenghast. Instead of Titus's birthday bringing with it a feeling of completion or climax as it should have done, there was, conversely, a sense of something beginning. Obscure forces were, through the media of the inhabitants of the castle, coming to a head. For some, this sensation was extremely acute, although unrecognizable, and was no doubt sharpened and conditioned by their own personal problems. Flay and Swelter were on the edge of violence. Sebelcrave was moving at the margin of climax, and Fuchsia hardly less so, being consumed with fear and anguish at the parental tragedy. She also was waiting. They were all waiting. Prunesqualler was suffering no little strain, and was eternally on the watch, and the Countess, having held interview with him and having heard as much as Prunesqualler dared tell her, and having guessed a good deal more, was remaining in her room and receiving hourly bulletins as to her husband's condition. Even Cora and Clarice could tell that the normal monotonous life of the castle was not as heretofore, and in their room they sat silently, waiting also. Irma spent most of her time in her bath, and her thoughts were constantly returning to a notion new to her, and shocking to her, and even terrifying. It was that the House of Groan was different. Different. Yet how could it be different? "Impossible, I said impossible," she repeated to herself through a lather of fragrant suds, but she could not convince herself. This idea of hers was creeping about Gormenghast insidiously, remaining for the most part unrecognized, save as a sensation of uneasiness. It was only Irma who put her finger on the spot. The others were involved with counting the portentous minutes before their own particular clouds broke over them. Yet, at the back of their personal troubles, hopes and fears, this less immediate trepidation grew. This intangible suggestion of change, that most unforgivable of all heresies. A few minutes before sunset, the sky over the castle was a flood of light, and the wind having dropped and the clouds vanished, It was difficult to believe that the mild and gilded atmosphere could ever have hallowed such a day as began so darkly and continued with such consistent violence. But it was still Titus's birthday. The crags of the mountain, for all their jaggedness, were draped in so innocent a veil of milk and rose as to wholly belie their nature. The marshland spread to the north in tranquil stretches of rush-pricked water. The castle had become a great pallid carving, swarmed here and there by acres of glittering ivy whose leaves dripped diamonds. Beyond the great walls of Gormenghast, the mud huts were gradually regaining the whitish colour of their natural earth as the late sunlight drew out the moisture. The old cactus trees streamed imperceptibly, and beneath the greatest of these, and lit by the slanting rays of the sun, was a woman on horseback. For a long while there seemed to be no movement either in her or her mount. Her face was dark, and her hair had fallen about her shoulders. The pale light was on her face, and there was a mournful triumph and an extreme loneliness. She bent forward a little and whispered to the horse, who raised his forefoot on hearing her and beat it back into the soft earth. Then she began to dismount, and it was not easy for her, but she lowered herself carefully down the wet, grey flank. Then she took the basket from where it had been fastened to the rope bridle and stepped slowly forward to the horse's head. Running her fingers through the tangled and dripping forelock, she moved them over the hard brow beneath. "You must go back now," she said slowly, "to the brown father, so that he may know that I am safe." Then she pushed the long, wet, grey head away from her with a slow and deliberate movement. The horse turned itself away, the rain bubbling up in the hoof marks and forming little gold pools of sky. It turned back to her once after a few paces. Then lifting its head very high, it shook his long mane from side to side, and the air became filled with a swarm of pearls. Then suddenly it began to pace along the track of its own hoof marks, and, without a moment's abatement in its pace or the least deviation from its homeward course, it sped from her. She watched it as it appeared, disappeared, only to reappear again, as the undulations of the region gave cause, until it was almost too small to observe. At last she saw that it was about to reach the edge of the last stretch of upland before its descent to the invisible plain. As she watched, it suddenly came to a dead halt, and her heart beat rapidly, for it turned about and stood for a moment, motionless. Then, lifting its head very high as it had done before, it began to move backwards, step by step. They were facing one another over that vast distance as the grey horse was at last swallowed beneath the horizon. She turned towards the mud huts lying below her in the rose-red light. A crowd had begun to gather, and she saw that she was being pointed out. With the warm glow of the dying light upon them, the mud dwellings, for all their meanness and congestion, had something ethereal about them, and her heart went out to them as 100 reawakened memories flew to her mind. She knew that bitterness was harboured in the narrow streets, that pride and jealousy leaned like ghosts against the posts of every carver's doorway, but for a fleeting moment she saw only the evening light falling across the scenes of her childhood, and it was a start that she reawakened from this momentary reverie to notice how the crowd had grown. She had known that this moment would be like this. She had foreseen such an evening of soft light. She had foreseen that the earth would be glassed with rain, and she had the overpowering sensation of living through a scene she had already enacted. She had no fear, although she knew she would be met by hostility, prejudice, and, perhaps, violence. Whatever they did with her, it would not matter. She had suffered it already. All this was far one history and an archaism. Her hand moved to her brow and pushed away a cold lock of hair that clung blackly to her cheek. I must bear my child, she said to herself, her lips framing the soundless words, and then I shall be complete, and only myself and all will be over. Her pupils grew vast. You shall be free. From the very beginning you shall be free of me as I shall be free of you, and I shall follow my knowledge. Ah, so soon into the julep darkness. She folded her hands and moved slowly towards the dwellings. High on her right hand, the great outer wall had become colder. Its inner face was draped with shadow, and in the depths of the castle, Titus, sending forth a great tear-filled cry, began to struggle with an unnatural strength in the old nurse's arms. All at once, an eyelid of the rich dusk lifted, and Hesper burned over Gormenghast as under Cada's heart her burden struggled.